In the first days of February 1943, the guns finally went quiet over the frozen, shattered ruins of Stalingrad. The battle, one of the most savage and decisive of the entire Second World War, was over. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, defying Adolf Hitler's direct order to fight to the last man, had just surrendered the remnants of his once unstoppable Sixth Army. For about 91,000 German soldiers, the fighting had ended. They laid down their weapons, convinced the worst was finally behind them. They couldn't have been more wrong. For the overwhelming majority, a fate far more horrific than combat was just beginning. Of the roughly 91,000 men who marched into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 to 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest were about to vanish into the snow-swept expanse of the Soviet Union, swallowed by a brutal journey into a network of prison camps. This is the story of what happened to them, a descent into a nightmare of starvation, disease, and forced labor that stands as one of the most appalling prison-era tragedies in modern history. To really understand the catastrophe that followed, you first have to grasp the condition of the men who surrendered. These weren't soldiers beaten in a fair fight. They were the skeletal survivors of a 2-month siege inside what the Germans called the Kessel, or cauldron. Ever since the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, slammed the trap shut around them in November 1942, the Sixth Army had been cut off, isolated, and systematically starved. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring had promised Hitler he could resupply the whole army from the air. It was a complete and utter failure. The airlift brought in just a tiny fraction of the food, fuel, and medicine they needed. By January, the soldiers were wraiths. They were eating their horses, then any dogs or rats they could find. Their uniforms were shredded rags, useless against a Russian winter that plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Frostbite was everywhere, claiming toes, fingers, and lives. Many men simply disappeared into the vastness of the Soviet Union, their final resting places unknown and unmarked. The disparity in mortality rates is striking when compared to other German POW groups. German soldiers captured by Western allies had mortality rates of 1 to 2%. Even those captured on other Eastern Front battles had somewhat better survival rates than the Stalingrad group, whose combination of pre-capture condition and timing made them uniquely vulnerable. Understanding the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners requires grappling with difficult questions of responsibility and context. The Holocaust and Nazi Germany's war of extermination in the East cast a long shadow over this tragedy. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was explicitly genocidal in intent, aimed at enslaving or eliminating Slavic populations and seizing living space for German colonization. German treatment of Soviet POWs was among the worst of the war. Of over 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of nearly 60%. They were deliberately starved, worked to death, or simply shot. Millions died in open-air camps with no shelter, food, or medical care. This was not negligence, but policy, rooted in Nazi racial ideology that considered Slavic peoples subhuman. Soviet treatment of German POWs, while causing catastrophic death rates, was different in character, if not always in outcome. It was driven by a combination of factors: logistical chaos, resource scarcity, desire for revenge, and pragmatic use as forced labor. It was brutal and cruel, but not genocidal in the systematic way Nazi policy was. This context doesn't excuse the suffering of the Stalingrad prisoners, but it helps explain the Soviet mindset. To Red Army soldiers and Soviet civilians, these were representatives of a regime that had brought unprecedented destruction to their homeland. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, more than any other nation. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The Germans had committed countless atrocities during their occupation. The failure to provide adequate care for German POWs must also be understood within the broader context of Soviet suffering. The Soviet Union itself was on the brink of collapse in 1941 to 1942. Its population was starving, its infrastructure destroyed, its resources utterly exhausted. In this context, providing for enemy prisoners was simply not a priority, particularly enemies who had caused such devastation. The international legal framework also played a role. The Soviet Union's non-ratification of the Geneva Conventions meant there was no binding legal obligation to provide certain standards of care. While this doesn't make the treatment morally acceptable, it explains the lack of formal accountability. The fate of the Stalingrad prisoners remained largely unknown in the West for decades. During the Cold War, both sides had reasons to suppress the full truth. The Soviet Union was not eager to discuss the mortality rates in its POW camps, while West Germany, seeking reconciliation with the USSR, downplayed these tragedies in public discourse. Survivors themselves often remained silent. Many were simply too traumatized to speak about their experiences. Others faced skepticism or indifference when they tried to share their stories. In the post-war period, Germany was focused on reconstruction and coming to terms with its Nazi past. The suffering of German soldiers, particularly those who had fought for the Third Reich, was not a topic that generated much sympathy. This silence began to break in the 1980s and 1990s as historians gained access to Soviet archives and survivors, now elderly, began to speak more openly. Books, documentaries, and academic studies started to piece together the full scope of the tragedy. Memorial sites were established, and survivor associations formed to preserve the memory of those who died. The city of Volgograd, as Stalingrad is now known, has become a site of complex memory. The battlefield is covered with monuments, but these primarily commemorate Soviet sacrifice and victory. German losses are acknowledged more quietly, often through individual grave markers or small memorials maintained by German veteran associations. For historians, the Stalingrad prisoners represent a case study in the brutality of the Eastern Front and the human cost of ideological warfare. The tragedy illustrates how warfare motivated by genocidal ideology creates cycles of atrocity and retaliation that claim victims long after the shooting stops. The surrender at Stalingrad wasn't the end of a battle. For most of the men captured, it was the start of a death sentence. Of the approximately 91,000 German soldiers who went into Soviet captivity, somewhere around 85,000 of them perished. They died on frozen death marches, in disease-ridden transit camps, and as forced laborers in the mines and forests of the Soviet Union. Their fate was sealed by multiple factors: their own horrific physical condition at the moment of surrender, by the logistical chaos of the Red Army, by the vengeful brutality of a war where all notions of humanity had been utterly abandoned, and by the genocidal policies their own nation had pursued, which created an environment where mercy was unthinkable. The return of the last few thousand wasn't a story of triumph. It was a testament to the sheer extremity of their ordeal. They were the lucky few who, through some random combination of resilience, chance, and perhaps small mercies, survived one of the most lethal chapters of military captivity in modern history. Their story stands as a permanent, chilling monument to the true human cost of Stalingrad, a cost that was paid for years after the final shot was fired. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to ensure these voices are never forgotten. They were almost out of ammunition, and medical supplies had long since run out. Wounded men were left to die in frozen basements, their injuries festering. So when they finally surrendered at the beginning of February 1943, they were already ghosts, severely malnourished, sick with dysentery, and deeply weakened by months of deprivation and combat. Many were already the walking dead, their bodies simply too far gone to endure any more hardship. The Red Army soldiers who took them prisoner were just as hardened and exhausted. They had just fought their way through one of history's deadliest urban battles. Their country had been ravaged, their cities annihilated, and millions of their own people murdered or brutalized by the German invasion. Let's just say sympathy for the invaders wasn't in plentiful supply. On top of that, the Soviet Union was facing its own massive logistical crisis. Its armies were stretched thin, and every available resource was focused on pushing the war forward. The sudden burden of nearly 100,000 half-dead prisoners was a problem they were neither prepared nor equipped to handle. There were no fleets of trucks waiting to transport them, no field hospitals to treat them, and no stockpiles of food to feed them. There was only one option: to march. Almost immediately after the surrender, the forced marches began. The prisoners were pulled from the cellars and ruins of Stalingrad and herded into enormous shuffling columns. Their destination was a series of crude transit camps, the most infamous being Bekhovka, several miles south of the city. For men who were already on the verge of total collapse, this short journey was a death sentence on foot. The guards, many brutalized by what they'd endured in the war, showed little mercy. Men who fell from exhaustion were often left right where they dropped, to be swallowed by the snow. Some were shot. The pace was relentless, driven by guards who didn't see defeated soldiers, but the perpetrators of a war of annihilation against their people. The prisoners stumbled through the frozen landscape with only the rags on their backs as protection against the wind. The snow was deep, and every step was a monumental effort. With every mile more men fell, their bodies quickly covered by fresh snow. Local Soviet civilians whose lives had been torn apart by the invasion sometimes reacted with fury, attacking the columns to beat the prisoners and steal what little they had left. The men of the Sixth Army were now completely defenseless, stripped of their weapons, their dignity, and their humanity. This trek to Bekhovka and other collection points was the first great filter of vicious culling of the weakest. It's impossible to know the exact numbers, but it's believed that tens of thousands may have died in just these first few days and weeks of captivity. For those who made it through the initial marches, the so-called reception camps like Bekhovka offered no relief. They weren't camps in any real sense, more like hastily cordoned-off areas of bombed-out barracks, unheated factory halls, or just open fields surrounded by barbed wire. Tens of thousands of men were crammed into these spaces. The conditions were apocalyptic. With no sanitation, the men were infested with lice, and with lice came the plague of the camps, typhus. The disease, which causes raging fever and delirium, tore through the prisoner population. In their weakened state, the men had zero resistance. A typhus diagnosis was basically a death sentence. Dysentery was also rampant, draining the men of the little strength they had left. Food was the other great killer. Rations were a joke, often just a few ounces of black bread and a bowl of thin, watery soup each day. It wasn't nearly enough to sustain a healthy person, let alone someone recovering from months of starvation. The prisoners became walking skeletons. There were even credible accounts of cannibalism as men driven insane by hunger preyed on the bodies of the dead. Mortality rates in these first camps were astronomical. By the spring of 1943, the Soviets themselves were overwhelmed. They lacked the doctors, medicine, and even the manpower to bury the dead. The vast majority of deaths among the Stalingrad prisoners happened in these first few catastrophic months. Now, this horrific treatment has to be put into its brutal context. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was a war of extermination, explicitly designed to enslave and wipe out the Slavic peoples. Of the more than 5 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans during the war, over 3 million were deliberately left to die from starvation, disease, and neglect. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had never ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of POWs. While Germany had, it chose to ignore it completely for Soviet prisoners. To be clear, this doesn't create a moral equivalence. The Nazi policy was one of systematic, racially motivated mass murder. The Soviet treatment, while causing catastrophic death rates, was driven by a combination of logistical collapse, a desire for revenge, and ruthless neglect, not a formal policy of genocide against German prisoners. For the Soviets, the men of the Sixth Army were agents of that genocidal regime, and they would be shown no mercy. By the summer of 1943, as the military and economic situation in the USSR began to stabilize, the way the Soviets viewed the prisoners started to shift. The initial wave of mass death began to slow down, partly because the weakest had already died, and partly because the state found a new use for the survivors: forced labor. The remaining Stalingrad prisoners, now maybe only 20,000 or 30,000 strong, were moved out of the transit camps and into a huge system that ran parallel to the infamous Gulag. This was the WWII, the main administration for affairs of prisoners of war and internees. While technically separate from the Gulag camps meant for Soviet citizens, the conditions in the WWII network were often just as brutal. The men were packed into squalid cattle cars for journeys that could last for weeks with almost no food or water. More died along the way. They were scattered across the Soviet Union, sent to work in coal mines in the Donbass Basin, logging operations in Siberia, and stone quarries in the Urals. Many were put to work rebuilding the very cities their own army had destroyed. Life in the labor camps was a grim routine of dawn-to-dusk work on starvation rations. Food was often tied to meeting impossibly high work quotas. If you failed to meet your quota, you got even less food, creating a vicious cycle of weakening and death. The work was heavy, dangerous, and safety measures were non-existent. The camps were run by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and discipline was harsh. Yet, even here, a strange sliver of hope emerged. As the prisoners became a key source of labor for the shattered Soviet economy, the authorities at least had a reason to keep them alive. Medical care, while still primitive, improved slightly, and food rations became more regular. The period of acute mass death was over. It had been replaced by a chronic, grinding attrition as men died from exhaustion, accidents, and the sheer despair of their situation. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the ordeal for the German POWs was far from over. For the few Stalingrad survivors still alive, the end of the fighting didn't mean freedom. The Soviet Union, devastated by a war that had cost it over 27 million lives and left its western regions in ruins, saw the prisoners as living reparations, a critical labor force for reconstruction. Starting in late 1945 and through the late 1940s, the Soviets began to send some German POWs home, but the process was slow. By 1950, most surviving German POWs had been released, but a significant number remained. This group often included men convicted of war crimes, sometimes on flimsy evidence, and sentenced to 25-year terms in the labor camps. Among them were the last of the Stalingrad survivors. For their families back in a divided Germany, these men had simply vanished. Their fate was a gaping wound in a nation already struggling with its own destruction and guilt. The years dragged on and hope all but died. The final chapter came only because of a major shift in Cold War politics. In 1955, 10 years after the war, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow for a historic diplomatic mission. His main goal was to establish formal diplomatic relations, but his most passionate plea was for the release of the last German prisoners. After tense negotiations, Adenauer struck a landmark deal. In exchange for diplomatic ties, the Soviets agreed to release the last of the German prisoners of war and civilian prisoners still in their camps. This event became known in Germany as the Heimkehr der 10,000, the return of the 10,000, for the rough number of prisoners who were finally coming home. Between late 1955 and early 1956, the last of the survivors, including the final remnants of the 91,000 from Stalingrad, boarded trains for Germany. Their arrival at the Friedland border camp was met with heart-wrenching, emotional scenes. These were men who had been gone for 13 years, men their families had long thought were dead. They were physically and psychologically shattered by what they had seen and endured. They had left Germany as young soldiers of the Third Reich and returned as middle-aged men to a country they barely recognized. Their world was gone, and they had spent over a decade in the frozen hell of the Soviet camp system. The story of the Stalingrad prisoners is not just about hardware or strategy. It reflects something deeper about the human cost of ideological warfare. The debate went all the way to the highest levels of government. It took exactly 23 days before a decision came down from the Kremlin about what to do with these final prisoners. What happened next violated every expectation the survivors had. The classified orders that authorized the release landed on Soviet officials' desks in the autumn of 1955. The conditions were extraordinary. First, the prisoners would remain technically under Soviet custody until they crossed the border. Second, they would be given minimal provisions for the journey. Third, every transport would be monitored by guards until the final moment. But the most important condition was this: the release had to proceed voluntarily from the Soviet side, without appearing as capitulation to Western pressure. When officials presented the terms to the prisoners, many didn't believe it. For nearly 10 minutes after the announcement, there was only silence in the camps. Later, survivors would describe that moment as one of the most surreal of their lives. They were being told they could finally go home after more than a decade. Their first response was disbelief. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they'd just heard. The reality of freedom, after so long, was almost too much to comprehend. The journey home began in stages. Prisoners were gathered from camps scattered across the immense Soviet territory, from the frozen reaches of Siberia to the steppes of Kazakhstan, from regions near the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Central Asia. Many learned of their release through rumors before official word arrived. Some refused to believe it, having been disappointed too many times before. The trains that carried them west were a strange mixture of hope and continued hardship. Though no longer in cattle cars, conditions were still sparse. They were still under guard until they crossed the border into Germany. As the trains approached the frontier, emotions ran high. Men who had maintained iron discipline for years suddenly broke down. The reality of freedom, after so long, was almost too much to process. The stories the survivors brought back painted a picture of almost incomprehensible suffering. In interviews conducted in the months and years following their return, common themes emerged: themes of endurance, loss, and the randomness of survival. One survivor described the first winter of captivity as hell frozen over. He recalled men simply sitting down in the snow during marches and never getting up again. They didn't even cry out, he remembered. They just sat down, closed their eyes, and that was it. By morning they were buried under fresh snow, and we marched past them. Another spoke of the labor camps with grim resignation. We were less than slaves, he said. Slaves have value to their masters. We were disposable. When one of us died, there were always more to take his place. Only when our numbers began to dwindle did they start to care whether we lived or died. The psychological toll was perhaps even harder to articulate. Many survivors spoke of a kind of emotional numbness that had allowed them to endure. You couldn't feel too much, one explained. If you let yourself think about your family, your home, what you were missing, you would go mad. So you shut it off. You became mechanical. Wake up, work, eat your soup, sleep. Don't think. Don't feel. Just survive one more day. Some had witnessed or experienced horrors they could never fully discuss. One man mentioned only briefly that in the worst winter, things happened that men should never have to do to survive. He would say no more, but the haunted look in his eyes spoke volumes. The story of the Stalingrad prisoners is ultimately one told in numbers, and those numbers are staggering. Of the approximately 91,000 German soldiers who went into Soviet captivity following the battle, somewhere around 85,000 to 86,000 perished. This represents a mortality rate of over 93%, one of the highest for any group of POWs in modern warfare. The timeline of deaths reveals the catastrophe's progression. The first few months were the deadliest. By estimates, possibly 40,000 to 50,000 died in the initial marches and transit camps during the spring of 1943 alone. The combination of their already weakened state, disease, exposure, and inadequate food created a perfect storm of mortality. The years 1943 to 1945 saw continued high death rates in the labor camps, though not as catastrophic as those first months. Perhaps another 25,000 to 30,000 died during this period from exhaustion, accidents, disease, and the grinding attrition of camp life. The work was brutal, the conditions harsh, and medical care minimal at best. Even after the war ended, deaths continued. Perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 more died between 1945 and 1955, succumbing to the long-term effects of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and the psychological toll of prolonged captivity. Each year that passed without release claimed more victims. Of the approximately 5,000 to 6,000 who eventually returned, many died within months or years of repatriation. Their bodies, weakened by over a decade of deprivation, could not fully recover. Cancer rates among survivors were significantly elevated, likely due to malnutrition and exposure to industrial toxins in the labor camps. Life expectancy was dramatically reduced. These numbers, however, tell only part of the story. Behind each statistic was an individual, a son, a father, a husband, a brother. In Germany, 85,000 families received no closure, no grave to visit, no confirmation of death.